So welcome to the newly renovated Oxford Martin School. My name is Julian Savulescu. I'm the Director of the Institute for Science and Ethics and the Professor of Practical Ethics here. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this debate on geoengineering, on solar geoengineering. We have two speakers who will talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then there'll be and then there'll be a general discussion, so we have plenty of time for discussion. And I want to try to get to as many of the questions that we have tonight as possible. So our first speaker, I think, for the affirmative is Professor David Keith. Is the Gordon Mackay Professor of Applied Physics and Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He has a book in progress arguing in favour of solar geoengineering. So, Professor Keith, would you like to begin?
Sure. Not to do undue book promotion, but actually a book that's been out for a while. No problem. Available. Thanks very much. And I should get, sorry, there's no timing here. Okay. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about what this idea is, and say a little bit about what I think the risks and uncertainties are, and then say finally a little bit about why I think there's an urgent need to make progress on figuring out how we govern it. So roughly the idea is that we could, it appears, reduce some of the impacts of the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by increasing the reflectivity of the planet deliberately, by adding reflective particles, say sulfate aerosols to the stratosphere, but there's a variety of other options that would increase the Earth's reflectivity, reflecting away a little more sunlight than nature does, and introducing a cooling tendency, and a tendency that tends to, in most places, restore the climate towards the pre-industrial, although it turns out to be kind of fundamentally imperfect and in principle imperfect. To give you kind of start maybe with the technical facts, which are kind of ugly and simple to say about how you'd actually do it, and then I'll kind of move on to what the implications might be. So if one actually wanted to say start in 2020, cutting the rate of change of climate roughly in half, this is the climate change caused by us, caused by continued combustion of fossil carbon, which is putting CO2 in the atmosphere, you could do that by starting to put sulfuric acid in the stratosphere, mimicking something very similar to what nature does when big volcanoes go to the stratosphere, though it turns out the details are quite different, but it's along that general line. And you could start with one or two aircraft that could be easily supplied by many different vendors doing that, and if you did that, say, for 50 years until 2070, cutting the rate of climate change roughly in half, by the end, by 2070, you'd be putting something close to 1 million tons of sulfur a year into the stratosphere, which is about, call it 2% of the amount of sulfur we currently put into lower atmosphere from combustion of fossil fuels. And then I think you would ramp down again to zero, say 50 years after that, and the net effect would be to considerably slow climate change and give yourself more time to adapt to climate changes, reducing the climate changes during that time, and so reducing the climate risk as we understand it, although imperfectly. And a few really sort of basic things to say about this. The fundamental understanding this is possible has been around for a long time. This is in many ways not a new idea. It's new to talk about it publicly, but the idea is not new. The idea was there in the mid-60s when modern understanding of the consequences of burning fossil fuels emerged, the fact that we will change the climate by doing so. But there was a sort of taboo in the scientific community about this topic, and the taboo was based on the fear that by talking about it, we would lessen the efforts to cut emissions. And I think that fear is well-founded and serious, but in my view, the consequences of climate change are serious enough, and the what we know about this technology looks promising enough that it's worth at least taking it seriously. That means studying it seriously, debating it openly as we're doing tonight. That's the fundamental thing I'm in favor of. At this point, I'm not in favor of doing it tomorrow. I don't think we know enough. I think there's too much groupthink to do that, but I do think we now have to look at it seriously. Taboo was broken in about 2006, and for better or for worse, this isn't a statement that it's a good idea. Things are now moving very quickly. We suddenly have research projects starting, lots of publications happening, governments being to get involved in debating the topic. So I've been in the UK House of Parliament and the US House of Representatives talking about this, talked with senior Indian officials and Chinese officials, for example. I want to address a couple kind of common misconceptions. We'll get to more of these back and forth in the debate, but one kind of fundamental misconception is the idea that if you start, you have to do it forever. And the most sort of tight version of this is people often say that a risk of this technology is acidification of the ocean. And I think the fact that that statement is made really gets at, I think, some of the key assumptions, and I don't even necessarily want to say misassumptions, but assumptions that underlie the way we think about this. So putting CO2 in the ocean, putting CO2 in the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels increases the CO2 burden in the atmosphere with very long consequences. So if we do what roughly humanity has done, which is have an exponentially increasing amount of fossil fuel combustion, and then we stopped, 1,000 years after we stopped, the climate change would still be, more than half of the climate change on the day we stopped. And that's because of the very long footprint that carbon leaves in the atmosphere, the very long lifetime of carbon. And that carbon is going into the ocean and increasing the acidity of the ocean surface. And so there's pretty much a simple one-to-one link between adding CO2 to the atmosphere and acidifying the ocean. This idea of putting sulfates in the stratosphere, good or bad, does essentially nothing directly to alter the acidity of the ocean. What it does do is, if you did it in combination with putting more carbon in than you otherwise would have, then the effect of putting in more carbon is, like it always is, completely independent of whether or not this technology exists. There is a direct consequence of putting more carbon in the atmosphere, which is to make the oceans more acidic. But the connection between them is only, and that's not a trivial only, but it's only if we have a joint policy for using this, which involves putting more carbon than we would have in some hypothetical world where we didn't use it. And the argument that says when you start, you must continue forever, assumes effectively that we want to use this technology as a substitute for cutting emissions. And to be absolutely clear, this does not work. It is completely implausible, and I know of no credible person making any claim that you could keep emitting CO2 forever and keep doing more and more of this and somehow have any kind of good outcome. So if you do that, you will walk the planet farther and farther away from the current climate state with greater and greater risks. To put it most simply, the long-term climate risk that we pass on to our great-great-grandkids, to people in the far future, basically depends on how much carbon we put in the atmosphere, period. And some other things, but pretty much just that. And doing this technology may or may not reduce the kind of climate risk on intermediate timescales. So this technology may allow us to significantly reduce climate risk in many places for people now living, including poor people who will suffer consequences of rapid warming, such as loss of crops over the next, say, half century, and reduce damage to ecosystems, but it does essentially nothing to reduce that long run risk that comes from the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. But on the other hand, because CO2 accumulates from the atmosphere so slowly, because of the great inertia of the built infrastructure, of the whole network of machines that sustain industrial civilization that are the things emitting CO2, it's not possible for us to magically make the CO2 problem go away. Even if we had a very strong political commitment today to begin a very strong transition away towards a zero carbon emission economy, even if we did that in, say, 40 or 50 years, which is faster than essentially any of the energy models say is feasible, you still have a footprint of CO2 in the atmosphere and of the climate change that comes from it that lasts for a very long time. And so, in a sense, I think these things are quite complementary. Nothing that we know about solar geoengineering changes the fact that in the long run we have to bring CO2 emissions to zero. And nothing that we know about CO2 emissions, climate change, and the energy system suggests that we can kind of magically make the problem go away by beginning a transition to clean energy. There are a bunch of other I think, kind of common misconceptions, some which Mike and I can get to in the debate. But another crucial one has to do with sort of certainty this will work and the idea that you can't test it except at full scale. So in a sense, that is absolutely right. We can never know precisely how well this works except by doing it. And if you want certainty in this business, you shouldn't do this. And if we were sitting around in Paleolithic times making a decision about whether we should invent industrial civilization and put CO2 in the atmosphere and also do this, it'd be rational to argue perhaps that you want certainty in both regards. That's not where we find ourselves. Like it or not, we are in a situation where we have an industrial economy doing what it's doing, we have a lot, an accumulating amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, And the consequences of that are predictable only roughly, not perfectly predictable. And the consequences of this are roughly as unpredictable. And while we can know a lot, we can know a lot from various subscale tests that would test specific risks. We can talk about what those are. And we can know a lot by gradually increasing the amount of this we did, gradually adding, say, more sulfur to the stratosphere and monitoring very intensively for specific problems like loss of ozone. There are ways you could potentially fix that, but there are also ways that it could be worse than expected. And that you could definitely know at quite small amounts. But knowing the actual exact climate response to doing this, you can't know. In fact, you can't even know it if you test it at full scale. And the reason is, for the same reason that we don't know exactly what the response to CO2 is, even though we've got CO2 in the atmosphere now. The atmosphere has a lot of noise in it, of unforced variability. So when you look at what the climate is, say over the last decade, what you see is a mixture of things, and carbon dioxide is only one of the many things that's changing the climate. And so it's impossible to tell perfectly from, say, looking at climate change over the last decade or decades, what was the climate change due to CO2, and that would likewise be true if we did solar geosharing. It would be impossible to tell, even if we used it full scale, exactly what its effects were. That's simply a fact of the uncertainty in the system. It's important to say, though, that that's not unique to this problem. So often, I believe we sort of have a phenomena in thinking about climate change policy where some people who maybe have worked only on climate change and think only about climate change policy think about all these big uncertainties, the fact that it's very uncertain, the fact that there's these long time scales, the fact that it requires very difficult political arrangements, and sort of assume that these are unique problems. But the fact is humanity actually faces many problems that have these characteristics, and we're making imperfect progress on many of them. And we can, I'm sure this will come up and we'll talk about this more as the evening goes on. But I think it's by no means clear that this problem is harder than many other problems we're actively engaged in managing. You know, to pick a most obvious one, we attempt to manage market economies to avoid very strong market shocks. So, you know, following the work of Keynes and others, following the very strong market shocks that we saw, say, in the 1930s that put enormous number of people's lives at risk and turned the economies that rolled upside down and helped to create a war, we decided in most industrial economies that we would attempt to have more active interventionist control of the economy by central bankers in order to reduce the amount of variability that we see in a capitalist economy, and to rein it in various ways by adding social programs to make it people less off when the economy shifted. And overall, I think those things have worked very well and made us substantially better off. But they are control of a high order kind of a system with a lot of inertia and noise, and the controllers, the people who run the economy, often get it wrong with big consequences. And here we have strong coupling between different countries and consequences that can very quickly produce, you know, a lot of people out of work in some part of the world with very strong political impacts. And it's not obvious, for example, that problem is much harder than solar geoengineering. In fact, if anything, I think it's much easier. I think the balance of evidence, the strong balance of scientific evidence, which I think Michael disagree with, we'll go back and forth, is that from what we now know, both from basic physics, from observations, from climate models, suggests that doing this will actually, if we do a moderate amount of it, not if you do a huge amount of it, if you do a moderate amount of it, will have benefits that are not perfectly equal, but broadly equal, and are kind of slow-moving and don't affect anybody so sharply as the kind of economic shocks we were talking about, for example, and many other kinds of technological problems we're trying to control. And so in that sense, it's actually maybe a more controllable thing, something that you can more plausibly and readily build institutions that allow you to manage this sort of scary beast. I'd say a general fact is the hard part here is not the technology or science. The hard part here is all about how we actually manage it, how we figure out how to build institutions to do this in a sensible way. There's no magic answer to that, but that again is true of many other new technologies where we're being forced to build institutions to think about how to govern them. Let's say maybe a little bit more about the problem of governance and then close. So the central problem that we have for cutting CO2 emissions is what's called a coordination problem. So I suspect many people around the world would actually vote, if they could vote to put a significant price on carbon and to restrain emissions in the economic system, they'd vote to do it if they were sure everybody else was going to do it. Because, of course, if I cut my emissions, the benefits of that goes to the far future and are spread around the world in the far future. And so in the kind of language of economists, I don't capture much of the benefits of cutting my own emissions. And so it's quite rational for me to decide not to voluntarily, not me personally, but anybody or a country, to decide not to voluntarily cut its emissions very steeply, because if you're going to do it alone, you won't achieve much in terms of improved climate or reduced climate risks. And yet it's also perfectly rational for the same person who doesn't make a big voluntary cut to vote for strong rules or laws that would put a high price on carbon around the world and help to restrain emissions worldwide. And you can think of analogies to garbage collection and many other problems that have this kind of public goods property, where you want to find a way to get most people to comply, you don't have to get everybody to comply, to cut emissions to achieve an overall public benefit. This is broadly called a public goods problem. We've got lots of them around the world. So the fundamental challenge in a public goods problem like this is under provision, that you tend to get less of the public good, in this case emissions cuts, than would be the thing that would make us all, on average, better off. And that's exactly what we've seen. We've known about this climate problem now since roughly the mid-60s. We've known about it certainly in pretty direct terms since the mid-80s, and it's been a high-level political topic since the 90s. And we've achieved almost zero in terms of cutting emissions. We certainly, that's not a statement that we couldn't cut emissions. We absolutely can. And I spent a lot of my time lobbying to get emissions cut and working on energy technologies to cut emissions. So emissions cutting is absolutely possible, but it's hard. And the underlying reason that it's hard, beyond the particular way that a particular negotiation didn't go right, or one's complaint about a particular politician didn't do what you hope they do, the underlying reason why it's been very slow is this coordination public goods problem. So I would say the challenge with SRM is almost exactly the opposite. So let's say that different countries had different amounts of this solar radiation management, this geoengineering that they want. For lots of countries, the answer might be zero. And you can think about this as countries or people or what have you, but let's think about countries, because they're the units that tend to make decisions. So it might be that for lots of countries, the amount of sulfates, if you like, that they like in the stratosphere would be zero. And for some other countries, it'd be varying amounts. Let's just choose units and say the country that wants the most wants 10 units of it. So if you think about what is the outcome if there was no negotiations and no group coordination, the outcome is if each country is free to act unilaterally, the country that wants the most will determine the answer in this case, because this technology is extremely cheap, so cost is not really an issue. And then what will happen is that country will get what they want. Great, checkbox. And everybody else will get much more than they want. And that's the over-provision problem. It's really the central governance problem for solar radiation management. There's going to be too much of it, or an expectation is there will be too much of it. I can give you lots of arguments why we actually may do zero, too. But thinking about it in the same framework as I thought about the carbon abatement problem, if you think generally about the problem presented by this technology, you can argue the problem is one of over-provision, of getting too much. And that's the underlying reason why I and many other people think that we have an urgent need to begin thinking hard about how we govern the technology. Because I think it only can provide a benefit, or only we can avoid the potential horrific outcomes of overuse of this by a program that actually begins to build institutions that are capable of making more rational, legitimate choices about how much to use. I think I'll start there, and I look forward to the debate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, and very good timing. Our second speaker is Professor Mike Hulme, Professor of Climate and Culture in the Department of Geography in the School of Social Science and Public Policy at King's College London, where he's also a member of the Environment, Politics and Development Group. He was the founding director between 2000 and 2007 of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. Right.
Thank you. So I'm going to start off with a scenario for you all to think about, if you can imagine this. So it's February 2032. Two glacial lake dam bursts in the Himalayas last October killed 35,000 people in Nepal. The Egyptian agriculture sector has collapsed following a 10th year of low Nile flows. Lake Nasser stands virtually empty. Western Sydney remains derelict and uninhabited following last December's uncontrollable wildfires. 6,000 Australians died in the blaze. Germany, one of the new permanent members of the UN Security Council, has put forward a formal resolution for the UN to start the systematic injection of sulfur into the stratosphere. In a speech to the Security Council, the German Foreign Minister claims that such a direct solar climate engineering measure is called for, given the conditions of the world's climate and its future prospects. January's inundation of the large parts of Hamburg following an unprecedented North Sea storm and sea surge, causing damage worth $40 billion, was the final catalyst for her claim of a global climate emergency. The world's population is 8.3 billion. Global temperature in the last decade averaged 15.2 degrees. That's 0.7 degrees warmer than the first decade of the century, and 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial. Coal, oil and gas continue to be burned worldwide in vast quantities. The IPCC comes along and delivers a special report for the Security Council on the regional climatic risks of such intervention. Based on the latest Earth system models, the panel recommends how much aerosols should be injected to reduce global temperature by ½ degree over the next decade. They also offer probabilistic predictions of changes in decade average regional rainfall around the world that would result from such a sulfur injection. They cautiously state that there would only be a vanishingly small risk of intensified tropical storm activity as a result. The 15 members of the Security Council consider Germany's claim of a global climate emergency and also scrutinise carefully the predictions made by the IPCC. Particularly, they spend much time debating the probabilities that the Asian monsoon might be weakened. Security Council members also argue about how long the initial injection should be for, 2, 5, 10 years. Against a background of vociferous and at times violent, globally coordinated public campaigns, some in favour, but many against such intervention, the Security Council votes 9-4 in favour, with 2 abstentions. None of the 5 permanent members exercise their veto. But as a compromise, initial deployment will proceed just for 1 year, after which a full evaluation will be conducted. The injection of sulfur will be managed by the World Environmental Organization, monitored by one of the new planetary citizen groups, juries rather, that Google established in 2027. Fast forward now to November 2032. A new generation of miniature super-intelligent drones in the stratosphere control and monitor the injection procedure. Over the following months, protesters attempt to sabotage some of the French military planes being used to deliver the sulfur to the sky. Direct action groups affiliated with the campaigning coalition group Hands Off Mother Earth send up their own aircraft in symbolic efforts to scrub the aerosols from the stratosphere. The Russian government comes under pressure from several of their newly rich shipping magnates to call for a suspension of the experiment. These tycoons were concerned that the delayed summer opening of several Arctic sea routes because of a longer sea ice season was a result of the sulfur injection. In the face of public and political protests, combined with the devastating loss of life following a super typhoon in the Philippines, in June, the deployment is halted 2 months early, in September 2033. Climate data are then evaluated against the results of the Earth system models, which had simulated an ensemble of counterfactual climates for 2033, assuming no sulfur had been added to the atmosphere. Measured global temperature fell from the previous decade, from 15.2 to just 14.7. It was the coolest year since 2013. The counterfactual modelling had suggested that without the sulfur injection, the temperature would have been 15.1. So the aerosol-induced cooling achieved 0.4 degrees. This is close to the IPCC's estimate that their designated injection of sulfur would cool the planet by ½ degree. But regional climate anomalies have been large and variable. Apart from the 130,000 lives lost in the Philippines during the most intense cyclone season in the South China Sea for 20 years, of most concern was the failure of the Asian monsoon. This cost the Indian economy $90 billion. Model simulations by the Earth system model community suggest a 73% attribution probability, so odds are more than 2 to 1, that this monsoon failure was indeed linked to aerosol injection. The Indian government demands reparations from the UN. India, now one of the rotating members of the Security Council, and China now trigger an emergency debate at the full General Assembly of the UN in New York in December 2033, calling for a permanent ban on deployment of solar climate engineering technologies. The scientists of the IPCC argue that 1 year's data prove nothing about the regional impact of sulfur injection and point to substantially reduced global temperature. But against the background of further global protests, led by the new popular civic movements of Brazil, Ethiopia, and India, the Assembly passed the Indo-Chinese resolution by a large majority. Turmoil now ensues as 2 Canadian billionaires unilaterally continue sulfur injection into the stratosphere. They believe the stabilising of the Canadian permafrost during the summer of 2033 was a result of the deployment. They claim that continued injection offers them a means of preventing future regional warming in the Canadian Arctic, which in recent years has caused much damage to their oil and gas pipelines. The Inuit Circumpolar Council brings an action against the 2 billionaires to the Supreme Court of Canada, sitting in Ottawa, on the grounds that sulfur injection violates the 2010 Nuuk Declaration on Inuit Ataqatigiit, which means sharing life. The year 2034 begins with heightened geopolitical confusion and tension. With no further chance of any approval of the technology through the UN, Germany and France, urged on by the coalition of disappearing island nations, decide to continue their own sulfur injection programs for a further 5 years to establish the extent to which such manipulation of the stratosphere can reduce the rate of global warming. Well, that scenario, of course, is imaginary. But it attempts to lay out some of the complex and interwoven political, civic, scientific, and humanitarian claims and counterclaims that would very likely accompany the deployment of solar climate engineering technology. So I'm going to argue against the desire to reduce the scale of future global climate-related loss and damage is, of course, one that I very much share with David. I just don't believe that solar climate engineering, as outlined in the technology that David summarized, is an effective way of achieving this. So, 2 main arguments to bring forward against this technology. First is that we must recognize that the welfare bads that we are trying to minimize relate to regional and local weather predominantly. And these are poorly correlated with global temperature or global energy imbalance. Using solar climate engineering to create a global thermostat may allow us to reduce globally averaged warming, and it may compensate in full or in part for global heat accumulation caused by greenhouse gases. But these globally averaged quantities are not what cause climate loss and damage. It is regional and local weather that does this. Droughts in America, floods in Pakistan, typhoons in the Philippines. So any call to implement SRM, climate engineering, solar engineering, to reduce the risks of anthropogenic greenhouse-fueled warming must establish what I call the core claim. So advocates must be able to convince all interested parties that the weather damages of a natural plus greenhouse gas but solar engineered climate, because there will be weather damages from that climate, will be substantially less than the weather damages of a natural and greenhouse gas only climate. That for me is the core claim. And this presents a significant epistemological challenge. It's one, I suggest, that distinguishes solar climate engineering from other forms of innovative technology, pharmaceuticals, GMOs, nanotech materials, and so on. Because there's no option here that parallels double-blind clinical trials to test a new drug, or multiple controlled and limited field trials to test GMOs. Apart from the sporadic and partial natural experiments afforded by volcanic explosions, such claims can only be tested through numerical simulation models. That is, unless one is prepared to undertake sustained, large-scale planetary field trials of solar climate engineering to discover by trial and error on the only planet that we have what are in fact the local weather effects. So what do these models that we then become dependent upon show? Well, they show that at regional scales, solar climate engineering leads to variable and contrasting changes in local weather, especially rainfall. Even if the thermostat is effective globally, it's not a reliable technology at the scales that matter. Here are a couple of quotes from leading participants in the recent NSF-funded GeoMIP model intercomparison project. John Fasulo at NCAR. It's very much pick your poison type of problem. If you don't like warming, you can reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the surface and cool the climate. But if you do that, large reductions in rainfall are unavoidable. There's no win-win option here. Or take Ben Krevitz, another one of the GeoMIP project leaders, writing recently, all models show that uniform solar geoengineering cannot simultaneously return regional and global temperature and hydrological cycle intensity to pre-industrial levels. But then, actually, there is still the question of the veracity of the numerical simulation models. If that's what they show, are they actually credible? Now, David himself will recognize that this is a question when he seeks to defend the core claim in his book. He says, these results are no better than the climate models they depend upon. And how good are these models? Well, I'm not dismissing climate models, but I do want to discriminate between their strengths and their weaknesses. I spent nearly half of my professional life studying climate models' ability to simulate regional and local rainfall variability, comparing empirical observations with the simulations from climate models. I don't have great faith in these models' ability to predict robustly rainfall at regional and local scales. And the recent AR5 report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just published in September, has shown that at subcontinental scales, state-of-the-art climate models do not robustly simulate the effects of greenhouse gas accumulation. To quote, at regional scales, precipitation is not simulated well, and the assessment of model reliability remains difficult owing to observational uncertainties. Now, those in favour, and I guess David may come back to me here and say, well, they would argue that this is precisely why we need more research, bigger and better climate models. Well, I've listened to claims like that for 30 years in my professional life from climate modelers. And I don't believe that climate models will be able to offer us the accuracy and the forensic precision necessary to safely guide and to evaluate and to defend against claims of legal liability in relation to local weather once sulfur is deliberately injected. I don't believe the real climate will behave like the model climate at these scales that matter for people and at which the political, legal and ethical repercussions are felt. And I'll just finish in a few minutes by saying something about that. Actually, as David himself recognizes in his book, local climate control is implausible. So solar climate engineering at the weather scales that matter for people and the things that they value is not a win-win technology, as John Fasullo, in the quote I just said, remarks. It's not even, I would suggest, necessarily a zero-sum game. Some will win, some will lose. At these weather scales, the real danger is that deploying this technology is more like a game of Russian roulette. We just do not know and will not be able to forensically establish a posteriori what the consequences of the technology are for human life and economic damage. So this is then bringing me to my second main argument, which is about whose hand will be on the thermostat. How will this technology be governed? And I argue that it actually would be ungovernable, or at least in any imaginary scenario that we could recognize as being desirable. All of the affected agents need representation in any decisions made and over any regulatory bodies established. No engineering without representation. Deciding when to implement the thermostat, agreeing what the setting should be, how it should be securely governed, would demand an unprecedented and simply unattainable degree of trust and cooperation between the nations of the world. We've had more than 20 years of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which can't be described as a roaring success. It's extreme optimism to expect a novel system of global governance can be invented and sustained over the time periods necessary for solar climate engineering to be effective. It's even more true when we recognize the extra geopolitical antagonism which intentional solar climate engineering would bring about, which is this. Because there are those who claim that at the moment their climate models are good enough to precisely attribute specific local meteorological extremes and by association ensuing human damages to greenhouse gas emissions. Specific local meteorological extremes to greenhouse gas emissions. Well, following sulfur injection, there will be nations who will want to claim that any damaging weather extreme that affected their nation and jurisdiction was indeed sulfur caused, rather than natural or greenhouse gas emission caused. The potential here for liability and counter-liability claims between nations is endless. And the challenge, if you believe these models, would be to attribute a real meteorological extreme event against a counterfactual greenhouse gas simulated weather regime overlaid with a further counterfactual sulfur injected weather regime. So if the UN isn't able to deliver these types of sustainable governance regimes, the alternatives, voluntary coalitions of interested actors or unilaterally implemented political entities, rogue nations, whoever, these are likely to lead to political rancor and to possibly military conflict. So I argue that this problem of how solar climate engineering would be governed does not just undermine arguments for its deployment at some point in the future. I argue it also undermines the case for undertaking research today into the technology and its consequences. It's not a sufficient response to claim that we need to better understand the technology in case we should need to deploy it in the future. Identifying the conditions of a universal climate emergency that might warrant deployment is a political and ethical project before it is a scientific and technical one. And again, just to challenge one of the points David talks about in his book, climate emergencies like this, a universal global climate emergency, is not discovered. It is constructed, it is made by political actors. Agreeing such conditions demands that expression be given to the multitude of perspectives and arguments about why a particular climate condition might or might not be deemed a universal emergency, and for whom. This is not a task for scientific experts, less even for engineers. The global thermostat advocated and designed and run by technocrats is no solution to climate change worth contemplating. It suggests the possibility of a view from nowhere, the possibility of a metaphorical cockpit for spaceship Earth in which benign and wise experts manipulate the planetary controls for the betterment of humanity. The necessary politicization of stratospheric aerosol injection technology must not be short-circuited by arguments which defer to scientific claims that humanity must in any case arm itself for the future. That is not an inevitable claim. Different interests will first need to be given to different voices from both powerful and powerless nations, from indigenous peoples, from people of faith and of no faith, and ventriloquized for those who are not yet born to give consideration to their interests. So in conclusion, some critics of solar climate engineering argue against the technology on the grounds that it would be a violation of nature's integrity. I recognise that argument, but that's not my primary position. I'm arguing against solar climate engineering because my reading of scientific evidence, the nature of international relations, and of collective human governance capabilities suggests to me that the risks of implementation greatly outweigh any benefits. There are surer ways of reducing the dangers of climate change through climate adaptation, through air pollution reduction and co-benefits for human health, and through, and we agree here again, through investment in low-carbon, clean energy technology. David and I are probably agreed that the debate about solar climate engineering is about values far more than it is about science. Two people can look at the same body of evidence, but on the basis of different value systems or other cultural commitments, evaluate these risks differently and reach a different conclusion about an appropriate course of action. Maybe I'm more risk averse than David. Maybe he's got more faith in climate models than I do. Maybe we bring different ethical and evaluative frameworks to bear on the question. Maybe it's the difference between an Earth system scientist and a geographer. The world has banned and heavily regulated science and technology in other areas of human inquiry. The banning of reproductive human cloning, for example, and the regulation of germline modification and mitochondrial replacement. I believe there is a similar argument to be made for a similar ban on solar climate engineering, certainly of field trials. solar climate engineering is not a technology that offers constructive welfare benefits. It is a technology that trades off one set of putative damages for another different set of damages based on the core claim that that trade is welfare positive. Rather than offering such a rational risk calculus, solar climate engineering in fact opens up a nightmare prospect of semi-blind and politically motivated weather designers. It's a prospect that will bring further antagonism, polarization, and possible legal, economic, or even military conflict to the world. In short, solar climate engineering is a flawed idea seeking an illusory solution to the wrong problem.
Would you like to make a couple of responses to each other, or would you like to go straight to questions?
I think you should decide that.
Well, why don't we take a couple of minutes, just brief
Sure.
response, and then we'll go on to the floor.
All right, let me start with the stuff that I think we completely agree about. And it's, I think, some of the ways in which what you've heard is a bit of a straw dog argument. So I completely agree. I've in fact said it myself, but not so articulately, that climate emergencies are constructed and not observed. That's why I mostly don't use that framing and have critiqued it a lot in other people. So total agreement, and I think most people do agree with that. It's a goofy framing. This is the framing that we should wait until there's some magic emergency and then, only do it then. That's a framing that kind of, in a sense, it sounds like nobody can disagree with it. Well, if it's a bad enough emergency, we should try this crazy thing. But a bad emergency, if there was such a thing objectively, is exactly one shouldn't try a crazy thing like this. So total agreement. And also total agreement that it's not right to think about this as being done by kind of objective technocrats who just kind of know the right answer or can deduce from science that this is something that ought to be done. If Mike knew anything about the work I've done, he'd know that I stand against that and have since the beginning. So when I first worked on this in the late 80s, I was one of the first people to bring some of the social sciences in to think about issues of justice and equity, justice between nations and equity. Those were things in the very first paper we wrote in 91 or 92. And we brought in issues of international control and of potential for war and really horrible outcomes. So indeed, I think it's fair to say, whether or not you think this idea makes any sense or not, that I've been a leader in trying to bring in the social consequences and trying to be absolutely clear that this is not something that gets decided by scientists, not decided by we who will design it. And so, total agreement, could not agree stronger. And I think all sensible, thoughtful people working on this agree with that. So I think it's important to kind of debunk those claims right at the beginning, because I think what you just heard a bit was a straw dog. If it was actually true that was what people were saying, you'd be right, but it's not. I think that the main thing to push back on is about this kind of underlying claim that it's zero-sum. In the debate we had in The Guardian, Mike simply said it's a zero-sum problem. And he just quoted some things which appear to say that, but don't. And the papers that the people signed on to don't. And I think I want to push on that a little bit, because it really does matter. So I deal a lot with climate skeptics, because I live partly in an oil town, and they tell me, climate models could do anything at all, and they're worth nothing. And one of the things I say to them is I say, it doesn't cost much nowadays to make a climate model. You could spend, $1 million or so, hire a bunch of smart people, and kind of write a model almost from scratch. And if you are so sure, Mr. Oilman, that it's all tunable, and you could make a model that obeys the law of physics and has nothing in it that we know is wrong and produces zero sensitivity to CO2, go ahead and make my day. Produce such a model. And none of the oil people have ever done that, because as far as we know, it's impossible. It might be possible, but it's never been done. I would kind of say the same to Mike. If he's so sure that it's a zero-sum game, this isn't a claim that climate models are great. This is a claim that they mean something. Produce a model that obeys the basic physics we know, has the core stuff in them, and produces anything like a zero-sum outcome. So what Ben Kravitz said is something we've known since the beginning, that I would say too. He and I are authors on the same papers, which is that if you, because of some really basic, well-understood stuff that we don't agree because of complicated models, we know because of very basic physics, that if you warm up the climate with adding CO2 and you restored the temperatures back to pre-industrial, which, by the way, I think is a nutty thing to do and I don't advocate, that you would then have globally average precipitation be less than it was. And so you can't do both at once. That is absolutely true. Everybody's known it for a long time, no big deal. But in fact, very, very far from showing that zero sum, what Ben's new paper does is show and I'm an author on it, and so is Alan Roebuck and others, show exactly what our paper already showed, which is that this is very far from zero sum. That in fact, according to models, and we can get back into whether you believe them, but the issue is, according to all the models we have and some pretty basic physics, this works in a way that is surprisingly equitable, and that actually turns out to limited amounts of this appears to bring climate back, reduce the rate of climate change in most places of the world, and thus produce significant benefits in most places in the world. It's important a little bit because you often, in listening to this, will wonder what people's preconceptions were, and you may imagine that my preconception was that I couldn't think of anything more fun to do than engineer the planet, but the opposite. In fact, the reason that we ever did the first climate modeling experiment with this, that Ken Calder did that, is Ken and I were faced with somebody who made very strong claims about how well this would work, and we said, no, you're wrong. And you're wrong because the way this works, it just doesn't look like CO2. The way that it putting solvents in the atmosphere forces the top of the atmosphere heating is very different from CO2, and so you wouldn't expect it to do a good job at all in compensating for the climate change due to CO2. And so in order to prove this gentleman wrong, Ken went back and actually ran a model intending to show how badly it worked, and in fact the model worked remarkably well, and spent a lot of time trying to understand why the climate system feedbacks appear to make it work that way, and testing it against observations that we have from natural analogs like volcanoes. So I think what I'd like to do is to push Mike hard in not a claim that we have to understand the exact climate everywhere, because of course we don't. That's ludicrous. So if we had to know in precise forensic way what the exact climate response was everywhere, well, of course, we're never going to do that. It's totally impossible, and it's a totally absurd claim. There are no large-scale policies that we know that well. And the idea that somehow the liability problems are insurmountable, consider liability problems the problems we're already dealing with. The Chinese are adjusting the way they regulate pollution for their coal-fired power plants. Those power plants now kill something in the order of 5,000 Americans a year from air pollution. Now. And they're not settling this with liability because there's no mechanism to do it. That doesn't mean that nations can't actually find ways to imperfectly do a little bit better towards an outcome that causes a little bit less harm, which is exactly what the US and China are doing.
Okay, I can see we've already got one hand up, but I just say another hand up and another hand up. Let me just give Mike an opportunity to respond, and then we'll go to the general questions. So.
Okay, so just on.
Later, maybe, or something. Should I say exactly as a quick thing? It's fine.
Can I just respond first of all to David,
give him
and
the
then
opportunity,
we
so
open
we've got absolute equality. I don't want to be favouring anyone here. And then we'll come to your question.
So just to pick up on those points that David has pushed back on then, I mean, first of all, the two elements of my argument about the core claim, and I would focus in on this core claim, because the core claim that would be the justification that sulfur injection would be something worth doing is that the weather damages that would result from what I call this climate that is a result of natural variability, greenhouse gas emissions, and sulfur injection, that those weather risks are going to be less than the weather risks that would be associated with natural variability and greenhouse gases. That, for me, is the core claim. And there's got to be a credible, powerful, and convincing argument. And the only way that you can make that argument is on the basis of climate models, seems to me, unless you really want to go down the full experimentation route, which probably, and I think I'm right in saying even David wouldn't propose to do that. So we're back to models. How good are models? At what are they very good? And the areas that models are weakest at, and I'm not a climate skeptic in any sense or shape or form.
Not much sure. Got to be careful here.
Right, okay, so here's an interesting claim.
Yeah.
Suggesting I'm a climate skeptic. Right, well, we can discuss that later on. Well, my point here is that models, climate models, are least good at their simulation of regional and local weather. And in particular, they're not very good at rainfall. And I quoted the IPCC, a very clear statement in the R5. And yet, that is exactly the scale at which you have to find evidence to support the core claim. And so that's why I'm very dubious that actually that core claim can never be brought forward with sufficient power and evidence that would actually convince political actors globally to actually agree that this was a technology worth implementing.
Simple question. Is that provable for CO2? If you used your same thing, if you said that to prove that CO2 was a risk, you had to not do what we have done, which is a sequence of simple models and observations and so on, but you had to have climate models that could at a very narrowly defined, you haven't given a scale, but let's say arbitrarily narrow, precise forensic level, let me finish, prove that climate with CO2 was worse than one without. My sense is you wouldn't succeed in that either.
Yes, because
basically you set the bar so high that
no, because what I'm focusing on, and this is I think why the sulfur injection is so particular as a technology intervention, is because it places the locus of action on very particular places and scales. The consequences of CO2 and other associated greenhouse gas emissions, the models are strong and credible at continental and above scales. So we know about warming, we know about sea level rise, we know about ice melting, but where models are least credible is at the scales where sulfur technology intervention claims have to be most convincing.
I think we're right at the core now.
Okay.
Can we go? Okay.
I think we need to go to, let me just see the hands again so I get them all. Okay, right, so I think you were first, the lady in the front.
Now this is science. Oh, sorry. Hello. You say it's science, but you haven't produced an equation. We've got to know what happens with CO2 and SO2, and perhaps H2O, but you cannot present science without equations.
I don't look. I can't.
CO2 is a very weak acid when it dissolves in water, called carbonic acid. Very weak. It's absolutely benign to us. It is food for CO2. The gas is food for plants. It actually isn't supposed to be in huge concentrations in water because the water's, well, wine-coloured acid. That's the way it's, slightly acid. However, SO2 is very, very highly acidic. And we've suffered in the past, because I'm old, of, what was it called, acid rain, and all the mortar and the lovely gargoyles and things were dissolving. And right now, the Great Barrier Reef and the rest of it, things in the world are dissolving because of acid seas. And so don't tell me that you can spray sulfuric acid into skies and nothing happens down here. Of course it does. It just gets more acid because you've got.
Okay, so sorry, we've got quite a. So
yeah.
Would you like to just? I presume that you've factored in the various chemical reactions into the models. Have you dealt with this kind of
that? Otherwise, we cannot understand it.
Okay, so let's have the answer then.
Sure. We haven't done it perfectly. These things are hard to do. But to answer some basic questions, the amount of sulfur that we're talking about adding would be about 2%.
And what is it making? CO2 plus SO2 equals what?
There's not a particular reaction there. So what
is the point of putting it up there? Because it does come down. What goes up comes down. We don't want to live in sulfur dioxide, do we? We're going to get asthma.
I'm not going to engage in a show.
Well, I presume the models have taken account of how much of the sulfur moves through the stratosphere and so on down.
Well, all the sulfur that you inject ends up on the ground, and so of course we're thinking hard about what the impacts of that would be to help.
Okay. All right. So I think we better go on to the next one. I think at the back was a question. Yeah.
Hi, Mike. It's Andrew Lockley. Just two things that you mentioned in the way that you were framing the problem. You sort of majored on extreme weather events as being a kind of central thing that you'd look to try and mitigate. But there are many other problems associated with global warming, such as extinction risk, methane coming from permafrost, etc., etc., etc. Now, 7 rainy days in a row doesn't bother me as much as maybe not being able to grow the right crops in the fields near where I live, to put it in a very kind of personal and selfish context. So I'm not sure the framing that you're using is really as relevant to the problem as it could be. The second thing is that there are there's a huge range of technologies that are widely available, relatively easy to make, but are subject to quite strict restrictions. For example, there's no industrialised country in the world that you can just wander around and buy an artillery piece and start shelling your neighbours with it. It doesn't mean that it's not possible to make those things or that companies don't buy and sell them. But we do manage over a very broad range of technologies, everything from GM to nuclear power to military equipment, to restrain the social consequences of the technologies that we have. And I think that mankind is actually often not given the credit for the degree of control that we as a society globally manage to exercise over many of these technologies. It's more reported in the breach. So I'm just concerned that you're looking at this through a very strongly coloured lens, and maybe that's making you come to conclusions which are perhaps at odds with David and other people who might follow the debate. I just wondered if you could respond to those 2 points.
Well, I focused on the consequences of weather risks for very particular reasons, because actually that is where most of the damages that is caused by weather take place. Whether that weather is natural greenhouse gas force, some combination of natural greenhouse gas force, actually it is weather that causes most loss of life and most economic damage. There are other risks for sure that are more slow burn issues around sea level rise, around ocean acidification, around, you mentioned about extinction risk. Many of those would actually not be reduced in any significant way at all by the sulfur injection, because the inertia within the system would not actually bring about benefits on the timescales that we're actually talking about here. So I do think that this core claim has to be able to bring forward strong evidential claims that by injecting sulfur, then it is the reduction of weather risks that cause economic damage and loss of life that have to be, that evidence has to be convincing. And about the managing the risks of technologies, actually what we're dealing with here is, of course, a whole array of consequences of fossil energy technologies. And to argue that we've actually handled those risks well, I would have to disagree with you. I think that's the whole point of the problem, is it not that we haven't handled those risks well, because we've been trying for the last 25 years to find ways of reducing the consequences of those technologies. And if we can't manage those risks well, then I think by introducing a further pollutant into the stratosphere to further complicate the response of the Earth system, with all of the political argumentation that would go along with that, I think is foolish.
Okay. Okay. Would you like to?
Yeah.
Short and country. We've got quite a long line of questions.
I think this issue of scale is crucial. So let's say that you took Mike's argument to what I think is the extreme that he's taking it, which is to say that all climate impacts are local. In a sense, that is obviously true. And so let's say you want to know the climate impacts on crops. Well, the actual physical size of an individual plant is small, so maybe Mike would say that you need to actually predict the exact impacts in a forensic way, as he said, to each plant, or you don't have anything. And of course the answer is we can't possibly do that for sulfates in the stratosphere or for CO2 in the atmosphere. And I think what I see as a sort of deep inconsistency, what Mike's saying, is he's somehow saying we have to have a much finer scale to assess the risks and benefits of sulfate than we do for CO2. And I'm not getting the kind of logical argument that gets me there. I think the answer is for both, in the end, all impacts are local, but that doesn't mean you have to have a model that perfectly predicts local impacts in order to say something useful about the risks.
Okay, I think we're coming to you. You're there's two in front. Yeah, then I think the next is the guy in front.
Hello. I wondered if the panel had considered the potential for abuse of the program that's being suggested. My position is I'm a chemtrail activist. I believe this stuff is going on. I believe one of the programs is harmful. I won't bore the panel with trying to convince them of my position. However, assuming I am wrong and it's not happening, and given the history of governments and the military for conducting covert operations and harming not only other populations but even their own populations, The potential for abuse of this program, in my mind, is extremely high, and nobody's referred to that. So I wondered what the comments were on that.
Do you want to start?
I think the potential for abuse is significant, and that's why I didn't use the word abuse, but I talked about bad outcomes such as war and bad outcomes because countries can't agree what to do. So to me, that's abuse. And I think the consequences of that are real, and that's why we thought about it for a long time. But I think in perspective, it's smaller than many other technologies. And the reason is the fact that, at least right now, it doesn't appear we can do this in a pinpoint way. You do this in a very broad way, and it looks like most people are affected in ways that are roughly similar. So compared to many other technologies where there is a potential for abuse, this one seems relatively less likely. So in the sense that if you think about the technology of the internet or technologies of genetically modified organisms, including potential pathogens, there's sort of immense destructive power and potential for abuse. I don't see that here in such a simple way. And so to me, as a sort of a governance challenge, I see this as real, but smaller than many, many other technologies that we're dealing with today with respect to kind of the potential for gross abuse. One last thing. There was a big military focus on weather control in both the US and the Soviet Union in the 60s and into the 70s. And that interest has largely gone away because it doesn't work very well. And this, you might ask, how can we think that this kind of climate intervention could work and weather control not? There's actually, I think, some good systematic reasons for that. But broadly, I would say the world has moved away from considering these things seriously in military terms.
Mike, would you like to?
Well, just that there are undoubtedly risks, as I mentioned, sort of, or alluded to at least in the imaginary scenario that I offered, that technologies do attract vested interests, and I mean this is part of the argument that actually once there's a certain momentum that builds up behind a technology, then obviously financial interests, political interests, and other powerful interests that can see the ability to further their particular ends and goals through a technology will very much get entrained, or the danger is that they will get entrained. And that is why one has to think about the sort of governance scenarios that could be brought forward that would allow this particular technology to be securely and sustainably governed over extended periods of time. This isn't just for a year or two, this would be for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, whatever. And I think it's incumbent upon those who wish to promote research into this technology that they also have to bring forward credible and believable and sustainable scenarios through which this technology could be securely and safely governed.
Gentleman with the blue, and then I've got over here, and then you.
Hi, David. I saw on YouTube you talking at Harvard about how this technology will kill people, and that you had someone working on the figures of how many people it would actually kill. I just wondered if you had any figures that you'd calculated.
So Steve Barrett, who's a professor at MIT Aeroastro and who has experience in trying to understand the health effects of aviation, which turns out to be a similar problem. So in answer to the other person's question, we are of course thinking hard about what the health consequences would be of anything we put in the atmosphere. And it turns out to be a very similar modeling problem. So aircraft put sulfur in the atmosphere now, and Steve has a big modeling effort to try and understand what the health consequences of that are in terms of ground level particulate matter that cause disease. And so we're applying exactly those same methods that he's used. It's been slower than expected, because science goes slower than expected, but I'd say we're now at the point where we have paper written up and will get released for publication soon. And actually what we found, and I don't want to give sort of the final answer where this paper gets out, but the obvious answer would be we kill roughly 1 million people a year from all sulfur emissions globally today. That's a sort of round number estimate from World Health Organization and many others. And so, if you were doing 2% of that amount of sulfur, and everything else was the same, you'd expect a number sort of like 2% of 1 million. But of course, the number's probably less than that because the current sulfur emissions are concentrated where people live, and this would be global. But it turns out the number may be much smaller, actually may have the opposite sign. That is, it may be that we reduce mortality by doing that for reasons that have to do with changing the ultraviolet radiation, and also changing the lifetime of SO2 in the stratosphere. in the troposphere, sorry.
Okay, I've got you on the list too now, and I think sorry, I've forgotten your name. Yeah.
Thanks, Julian. So this is a question to Professor Hulme, I think. In the terms of the epistemology, in terms of you getting in conversation, one of the things you said was that we can't run randomized control experiments on an international scale, and that's obviously true. But one of the examples that I think Professor Lee, I think his name, said at the beginning is about macroeconomic introductions. So it seems like we don't run randomized control experiments when we're dealing with macroeconomic interventions. So do you agree that that would be a good analogy, or do you think that that would not, and why? Would that help in terms of epistemology, trying to figure out how it fits? Thanks.
Well, I mean, I'm not here to defend the way in which governments or financial regulators manage national or international economy. I'm not comparing sulfur injection technologies against financial management technologies. What I'm concerned about is that sulfur injection technologies is a bad idea. And so what I actually want to do is to analyze that technology on its own grounds and criteria. So my point of using the parallel of randomized controlled trials is that there are other types of technologies, if you will, like pharmaceuticals and medical drugs and so on, where you actually can do these randomized blind control trials to see how safe or dangerous the particular chemical is. And my point is you cannot do that with sulfur injection. You can do it in models, but we've had that discussion already about models. The only way you can actually do it empirically is to do large-scale field trials at planetary scales. And that, for me, is not a route that I would want to propose that we go down.
Can I try that? So, first answer was that it's a bad idea. Well, if you know it's a bad idea, then it's simple. But of course, the question is, given the balance of evidence from the climate model suggests that actually it's a useful idea that helps people, you've got to be pretty sure morally that you don't want to proceed down a route that where the balance of evidence says it'll help people. The second argument that he essentially makes is that it's a hard governance problem. Well, yeah, but that actually doesn't say anything in public policy terms. It doesn't help us unless we say hard compared to what. At some level, all governance problems are hard. So the reason I'm bringing in these other analogies is to say, how hard is it? Because it's not good enough just to say it's a hard governance problem and throw up your hands. There are innumerable hard governance problems, and we don't throw up our hands for all of them. And in order to make any kind of evaluation, serious evaluation of how hard this is and how likely it is that Mike's argument is right, because, I mean, to be clear, there is a kind of core argument that makes sense there. If this really was such a hard governance problem, there's no way we'll solve it, it's fundamentally unsolvable, then it might be a good argument to say you should suppress research. And so, but to make that argument, you can't just say use the word hard. You got to compare it to other governance problems, and that's what I'm trying to do. No, you have to look at the particular conditions of this technology. I mean, I think it is it's a wickedly hard governance problem. And what you're doing is you're having to compare it with or you're having to look at the particular conditions under which this technology will be brought forward, how it would be deployed, how it would be used in political, economic, military or humanitarian circumstances. And when I look at all of those factors, I cannot imagine a world in which we would agree to deploy this technology in a way that would be sustainable and secure and democratic. So actually, I do think that is a very decisive point against the actual research of this technology. Okay, I've got quite a line of questions now. Hang on, sorry. Let me just. I just want to make sure I've got you in the line. So at the back there's another one, and then there's one over here, and then you haven't asked a question. You haven't. No, I've got you. You're almost next. You're next.
Robert, Chris, I've got a question each for Mike and David. Mike, you say that in order for this whole notion to progress, the governance issues would require consensus across the board for the industrialised countries, the small, affected, vulnerable countries. You also mentioned future generations whose views, I think you used the novel word, should be ventriloquised. Now, if you adopt an affected party's approach to this issue, presumably one has to accept at the outset that the vast majority of the people that will be affected will be future generations, distant future generations. So it is actually the ventrivalization of their views that will really should weigh very heavily in the deliberations. Now, as far as I am aware, in the interaction between a ventriloquist and his dummy, there are some major issues about the will, desire, the means by which the dummy expresses his feelings. And I am deeply troubled, and the question I really want to ask you is, if you want to pursue this consensus idea as a criterion for establishing, or not, as the case may be, some governance regime, are you not actually setting the bar so ridiculously high that in fact no form of social policy that has long-term effects could ever succeed? That's a question for you. David, the question for you is that you've acknowledged that climate models have their limitations. I think there's consensus around the table that they have their limitations. Yet you are arguing that in certain circumstances, subject to further knowledge and so on and so forth, we might need to consider deploying this technology. What I'm intrigued to understand from you is, how do we transition from the unreliable models and the theorization in the lab to learning by doing, by actually making it happen in the real world? And I just simply don't understand how we can have, on the one hand, this argument about all of these issues with models, and at the other hand, understand how we kind of jump from there into the real world.
Right, Mike first.
Okay, so I don't actually think I used the phrase consensus governance. What I argued for
You use the word affected parties, all affected parties.
needs to have a voice and to be recognised at having a voice. So I wasn't actually laying out an ideal and essential form of governance of this technology. What I was actually laying out was a procedural case that if this technology was going to be deployed, and actually by association my argument, even if this technology is going to be researched, then actually there's a prior set of considerations before we start talking about the science and technology of this, which is about under what conditions might it be right or appropriate in order to use this sort of technology. And that discussion procedurally has to have all interested parties represented. So I'm not talking about consensus.
How do you argue it must? Where is the normative?
Okay.
It must have all affected parties.
Because
and who determines who all the affected parties are?
Well, because all parties, all sentient beings on this planet are potentially subject to the implementation of this technology, which again actually separates out sulfur injection as a deliberate intervention from other sorts of technologies which have often more limited domains of impact. What we're dealing with here is all sentient beings and those who are yet to come. So I'm taking a very strong normative position there, for sure, in terms of procedural justice, that all of those interested parties should have some form of representation, some form of voice, some sort of recognition. What I'm not saying is that therefore means that we have to have some type of consensus process to govern the technology. What we actually have to have is that procedure in place in order to actually debate whether we should be even researching the technology before we reach a stage where we actually might deploy it.
Okay, we've got quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to have to cut you off there. David, can you stick to your question?
I don't guarantee that. I think the short answer is to get away from the Big Bang implementation. So the 2032 scenario that Mike envisaged had people turning this on enough to cut out half a degree in 1 year, which would be insane. I mean, very dramatic climate changes. I can't imagine anybody rationally recommending such a course, because you'd for sure have a sort of climate shock. And you'd be starting big, so you'd have no chance to measure some of the unintended side effects, sort of the stratospheric chemistry side effects. So just to be clear, I'd be dead set against that. So I think if you did it, the technical answer is that you'd start by doing very small amounts to first measure bits of atmospheric chemistry to do with the potential risks like stratospheric ozone depletion, and only then would you begin to ramp it up enough to begin to just barely detect the radiative forcing. So that's the short answer. But I want to come back to what Mike's just said. I mean, the idea that it's a normative fact that all sentient beings must be considered and have a voice before you decide something would mean no social policy of any kind. No policy about restraining CO2 emissions, same problem, you can't consult them all. No policy about whether or not we make progress in human germline manipulation. No policy of almost any major technology, because you can never consult all sentient beings.
Okay.
I talked about representation, which is slightly different.
Okay. So I've got you next, then you, then you, then you, and then you. So yeah, you've got the microphone.
That's the first one.
I don't know. It's on.
I can hear you.
Hello. I'm so pleased we're having a public discussion about this, because I've been researching this information. I live in the south of France. I've come here especially to hear this. I think it's a very, very important topic. As you know, it's been going on, it's been researched for a very, very long time. Now, I've got a question for each of you, the three of you. The idea that we want to return the climate to pre-industrial times as the ideal climate, I think you said. No, well, you did say pre-industrial times, and you said pre-industrial times. Now, the pre-industrial times was at the time of the Little Ice Age. When did the Industrial Revolution start? We're using timescales.
I'm not advocating bringing the climate back to pre-industrial. I'm advocating that, first of all I'm advocating right now is that we do research on this in a serious way.
Sorry,
and all I'm advocating now is that we do research on this in a serious way, including research on these hard questions about how we govern it. And if that research kind of demonstrates the initial promise that I and others have seen, which it may not, one good thing research may do is demonstrate that it doesn't work, then I would advocate something that was much more moderate than that would simply be reducing the rate of climate change.
Okay, well, but you have been doing a lot of research. I've been following your work for a long time, so you have done a lot of research. What you're specifically talking about is deployment.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
okay, that's fine. Now, the idea of spreading lots of particles into the atmosphere, what's a cloud condensation nuclei?
I'm happy to go back and forth. So if you take water vapor and if you take water vapor in a perfectly clean atmosphere in a laboratory, and you have water vapor and you cool it down so that it wants to condense, if there's no tiny little particles there, the water will not condense. The water molecules need something to stick to first, and that's what a cloud condensation nuclei is. It's something for the water molecules to stick to when they're ready to do that. Yeah.
It's a particle. And you're proposing spraying lots of particles into the atmosphere? Into the stratosphere that eventually fall into the troposphere?
Yeah.
So lots of particles added to the atmosphere will make extra cloud condensation nuclei?
Well, this is where you have to have numbers. So if you look, this is where you need numbers. So
Okay.
lots is sort of useless in this context. So
Okay.
if you ask how much we'd be changing the cloud condensation nuclei above background, it would be parts in 10,000. I'll do the calculation afterwards and come back to you if you give me an email, but it would be really small.
I would like to,
Yeah.
actually. I have many, many questions for all of you, but obviously I know there won't be enough time. The transborder issues, if you don't have a global acceptance, then due to the way the atmosphere works, those particles will inevitably travel around the whole globe. Is that correct? The jet streams will take all
yes.
the... Now, in the past, you've talked quite openly about using alumina, and there's an awful lot of research into that. So you've not mentioned it at all tonight. Does that mean that alumina will not be used now? Because you haven't mentioned it, but you've mentioned it an awful lot in the past.
Well, I don't think there is a lot of research going on. I know of a couple of groups that have looked at it a little bit. There's no paper that's just dealt with it. I mentioned in the past because it's something we thought would have lower environmental impact. And we're actually in the middle now of doing some modeling related to it, which suggests that it might or might not. There's all these knobs of uncertainty in these models. It's not my job to say what is done. I completely agree with Mike. It's not the job of the scientists to do that. This is all, so the answer is, if you're sort of referring to the chemtrails view that there's large-scale amounts of alumina now being dumped, I regard that as illegal, wrong. I don't think it's happening, but if it was happening, it would be illegal and wrong, and I would do all I could to stop it.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, because I think there's an awful lot of evidence that we can bring to your table for you to look at, and if you're true to your word,
Sure.
I'm quite certain that we'll keep you busy.
Okay.
I have an important question for you, Julian.
Well-
On your blog, in 2010,
Yeah.
you wrote that we have, of course, been geoengineering for years.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about, could you elaborate a little bit?
Well, I mean, we're geoengineering today by pumping, huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. We're pumping sulfate into the stratosphere by using.
But just to be clear, because I think the underlying question, you don't believe that we're deliberately putting aluminum and barium at the top?
No, that's not what I was referring to.
Yeah.
But the point is that every day we now know the effects of all of the actions that we're engaging in. Maybe a few hundred years ago we didn't. So we are actually geoengineering the climate today. So it's not as if we can say, the one strategy is to say, well, let's just stop doing that or reduce it radically. Okay, that's the dominant alternative. But if that's not being done, you have to recognise that we're all geoengineering the climate. We might not like to describe it that way, but that's the reality. That was the point that we're making. And so there's a basic ethical discussion around whether we are responsible for the foreseeable effects of our actions or only the effects that we intend to happen, what we want to happen. And there's a dominant tradition that rejects this distinction between intention and foresight. If we know that these effects are going to occur, then we're responsible for them. So insofar as we can predict them with climate models, we're responsible for the engineering that is occurring today. So it's not as if we can avoid the question of geoengineering unless we can adopt these quite radical strategies that have so far relentlessly failed. So the question is not, are we going to geoengineer the climate at some point in the future? We've been doing it, and we are doing it. So I think people lack that perspective. We're much more responsible for geoengineering the climate than we realise.
But can I pick that up, because this is, again, it just helps to identify a key point here, is about intentionality. The reason why industrialised nations started combusting coal 200 years ago was to bring about a welfare benefit, which was, and over the last 200 years we have seen the huge welfare benefits that have come about through burning cheap oil, coal and gas. And it continues for many, many people to deliver energy services that, for good or ill, people will value. Sulfur injection has got no public benefit other than to reduce the weather damages caused by greenhouse gas forced climate changing, which is why I come back to my core claim, which is absolutely central to the entire case for sulfur injection, because there is no other reason why one would inject sulfur into the stratosphere. There are many reasons, some of them good, some of them not so good, but there are many reasons why we have been burning oil, coal and gas. So I do think this question about intentionality and what are the goods and the bads, and what is the justification for that intervention, the core claim, as I put it, is actually central to my argument.
Okay, we should give the others a go. If we've got some time at the end, I appreciate you've come from the south.
I've got so many questions,
Yeah.
it would be impossible to fit them all.
Okay, I think the gentleman just to your right, just here was next.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, so far the discussion seems to assume that these effects are gradual, and I guess I was wondering if what role like hysteresis or feedback loops might play, and whether or not the uncertainty actually holds more of the risk than the 2% that the models predict. So in other words, does the uncertainty about geoengineering or not geoengineering actually hold the majority of the risk rather than the things that we do know right now? If that makes any sense.
So are you saying that the potential for rapid nonlinear changes in the climate system, yes, because of greenhouse gas forcing, pushes the argument in favour of sulfur injection?
In favour or against. I mean, the feedback loops could come from either the geoengineering or the lack of the geoengineering. I don't know. I'm just saying the stakes are potentially higher.
Okay, so I mean, part of this comes back, I think, to this notion of a climate emergency, which some people have used rhetorically in order to defend and to justify developing this, or to arm ourselves for the future in case of a climate emergency. So the question is, what is a climate emergency? Some of my assistant colleagues will tell me, well, an emergency would be if we knew that huge methane releases were going to be released from the high Arctic because of rapid warming. There are many such scenarios one could come up with. I would also, though, as I have done with Tim Lenton in this sort of discussion, is say to him, actually, was a climate emergency in the early 1970s in the Sahel of Africa, when rainfall declined by 30% and hundreds of thousands of people died? Was that a climate emergency that would have been sufficient if, let's say, one had the technology at that time, back in the early 1970s? Would that climate emergency, that rapid nonlinear change in Sahelian rainfall, would that have been sufficient to release sulfur injection into the stratosphere? So my point is, about a climate emergency, it is always constructed by political and ethical argument and interests.
Okay, we're almost out of time.
Thank you.
And I want,
Thank you
there's,
both.
there's a the guy near the walls. Yeah. And then, so I'll take two questions now. If we are sort of out of time, so if you can make them brief. I know now okay, I've got you.
I would like to know, a question to you. I've heard on the internet that you've had death threats to you and your family, and I would like to know, why do you think that is? Do you think it's because your geoengineering is not going on, or do you think it's because it's going on? Because everybody in this room seems to think it's going on, except you, and you. Well, all right, there's a couple of people that do. There's a couple of people that think it isn't, but there's a majority of people that do.
Wonder if that's true.
Wonder what's true.
How many people, could people put their hands up if they think there is now large-scale, not geoengineering in the sense of burning carbon emissions, but if they, can I?
So the radiation program in Africa?
So, how about one speaks at a time? That's a good kind of basic rule for rational discussion. So how?
Huge amounts of aluminium, iron, zinc, and copper in my rain. Where does that come from?
So how many people think that there are now large-scale government programs to deliberately release chemicals for some nefarious purpose from aircraft? Yeah. So there's lots of you in this room.
Well, that wasn't
And
the question. The question was, why do you think you're having death threats, you and your family? I don't get death threats.
I'm happy to get to your question. I think.
Okay, so sorry. So we are out of time, and I'd like you to answer this and take another question or two. So maybe if you could deal with this generic issue.
I think the answer is simple, because if it was really, so we can only talk if I let you speak. So if you interrupt me, I'll stop speaking. If you want to hear what I have to say, you need to.
You say is full of shit anyway.
Well,
then I won't say anything.
Okay, so I think we'll take the last question at the back. There's a lady here. I'm sorry, we're...
Therese Philo, Oxford University. Just to catch up, or just to follow up, I mean, the Congress of the United States in January received a document by the Congressional Research Service that informed the congressmen that various actions pertaining to geoengineering research had already been undertaken not so much at the federal level in the United States, but at a state's level, and the report mentioned various agencies involved in this. The Department of Defense, the Department of Agriculture, and various other bodies. So it does seem to me that gradually, there are these governance initiatives, also by various engineers. It does seem to me that gradually even politicians are being informed that geoengineering research is taking place, and this congressional publication is only one of many available. So I wonder what you could say on that.
Well, Mike, maybe I'll give this one to you.
What this debate is about, and what I'm interested in, is this particular technological proposal to engineer the global climate through the injection of sulfur into the stratosphere. I know nothing at all about any of the other reports or supposed interventions into the sky. And my concern about this technology is that the sulfate injection into the stratosphere with a view to manipulating the climate deliberately to offset supposedly some of the climate damages and risks caused by greenhouse gas emissions, that technology needs to be thoroughly and comprehensively scrutinized and evaluated through processes of broad representation that allows multiple voices and interests in what would be called an upstream process of engagement before there is any consideration of field trial experimentation and certainly before any significant deployment of that technology. That's my primary concern.
Mike, would you mind just clarifying? Do you think that there's now active government activities to put sulfates in the stratosphere for this purpose?
None that I know of.
Yeah.
None. I know of no government-funded sponsored activity, or I know of no private-sponsored activity to put sulfur into the stratosphere.
I'm going to ask the last question then, just on a related topic. So I understand that you haven't been involved with or have any knowledge of any projects to place sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere at this point in time. But I guess that, and this is to give you the opportunity to I think maybe deal with one background concern, that in addition to your appointments at Harvard Kennedy School, you're also the president of Carbon Engineering, a startup company developing industrial scale technologies for the capture of CO2 from ambient air. Now, I would imagine that some people would have a concern about a conflict of interest in terms of being the president of a company that stands to derive a financial benefit from the advance of this technology versus the academic discussion as we've been having here today about that. Now, I'm not saying that that's my view.
No, that's a fair question.
I just think that this is your opportunity to say.
Well, there's several other, yeah. So the answer to that is simple. I don't do, so yes, I run a company that is attempting to do capture CO2 from the air to make low carbon fuels. For example, we would supply those fuels to companies that do development of algal biofuels to sell low carbon fuels that have a lower carbon impact to transportation sector. And in my view, there is a conflict of interest between that and me advocating action on climate change in some respects, and I'm very careful of it in various ways to say it out loud. And I have been accused by people in the oil industry that the only reason that I talk about climate change is because I now have a company that could profit if there was regulation to restrict climate change. I think the answer to that is I worked on climate change for half my life, 25 years, long before I started the company, so you got to figure out which view came first. With respect to this technology we're talking about here, actually, far from being a conflict, they point in the opposite direction. To the extent that this solar geoengineering technology really was taken up, if it's right, as many people feared, that would lessen the pressure to reduce emissions. That would actually be harmful to carbon engineering, not beneficial to it. So I don't think there's really any meaningful conflict there.
So your company has nothing to do with the solar radiation?
Oh, more than that. Well, no, but this is important to say, if you're even implying that. Well, you just did.
No, so it's worth making that point.
Okay, if it's going to be about me at that level. So not only does it not, but I am on record and have done a bunch to try and stamp out any commercial activity on solar radiation management. I've been involved in some efforts to try and prevent patenting and explore whether it would be possible legally to block patenting. I've been a long advocate for very strong rules about transparency and trying to exclude the commercial sector. And my company most certainly doesn't. Indeed, it's very harmful to my company that I talk about it because it continuously makes it harder for us to act in the normal company's activities. So no, I'm absolutely not involved, and I'm very strongly against any such activities. As to the question about depth threats, I think the answer is the kind of anger that you just showed in responding to me.
Yeah, well, somebody is spraying the skies, right? Somebody is doing something in the skies. I've got video footage of it, thousands of hours of it, right?
So
who is it? Somebody is taking your testing things, your models and all your stuff, and they're using it. Somebody is using it.
So I want to point out, I don't know.
Anyone can see it. Just look online.
Can I just ask a question?
Can I? How about I speak?
This is going to have to be the last question.
So can I finish my sentence? Could I finish my sentence? Could I finish my sentence? This actually matters to me. I actually have got death threats, okay? So that kind of anger, and I prefer if you don't speak, again, that kind of anger and people putting on the internet things that claim directly that I'm doing something that causes the murder of millions, people who put that stuff casually on the internet or repeat it without evidence bear some moral responsibility for my potentially getting hurt. Because some people read it who know nothing, and they get angry late at night when they're drunk, and they approach us. This happened. We had to call the police. It was serious. And if that happens, and just to be clear, there's a moral responsibility there. So if you guys are going, some of you in this room, I believe, are going to, yes? Well, that's great that you don't, but clearly some people do.
The issue is one of disbelief.
Yeah.
I think the majority of people who are convinced about this subject cannot fathom how you cannot be aware of it, because to us it's completely obvious. So that's where the conflict.
Fair enough.
If truly you don't know about it, then we can only have respect for you for promoting research into it. However,
but I'm not promoting research. I think we're mixing up what it is. So if by it you mean the thing that the chemtrails websites are filled with,
what we believe to be happening.
right? The answer is I have absolutely no evidence, and I have all sorts of common sense reasons why it seems extremely unlikely. But the thing that I'm advocating research into isn't that thing. It's something quite different that happens to have been conflated by what we're seeing here. But for better or for worse, whether Mike is right or I'm right, the thing that I'm actually advocating has nothing to do with the thing you're talking about.
But it's a question of trust, isn't it? We don't believe that once you have established trust with the public for your proposed programme, which would be benign if you do what you say you're going to do, it's a question of trust. We don't believe that once you start it, it will be benign, because we see what's going on at the moment, which is definitely not benign, and so therefore we have no trust in you. And we believe that what you're trying to do is an exercise of subterfuge. You are trying to soften the blow so that when you have to admit what's going on, you can say, we will then go, oh, great, okay, no worries, we know you did it to protect us. We don't believe the story.
Okay,
I think
well, can I say, as my debating opponent, I have got absolute trust in David's integrity, and I believe absolutely what he has revealed here this evening. My challenge to him is simply on this very particular technology that we've been debating, and I have got absolutely no grounds whatsoever to question his trust as a scientist and as a public commentator around these ideas of solar climate engineering.
I'm sorry, we've run over by more than 10 minutes. I'm going to have to obviously we can't cover the whole of this very important topic in this very small amount of time. I hope we can have another debate. And I thank you for your very polite